The clock struck 6 in the morning when Enzo Morelli opened his eyes for the first time in days. The sun streamed through the windows of his Milan apartment, but there was no warmth. The white walls reflected the lifelessness that dominated the space, where everything seemed carefully planned so as not to hurt. The dried plants on the balcony betrayed the passage of time, something he tried to ignore. Since the accident, Enzo had lived in absolute silence, interrupted only by the sound of his pencil scratching against the paper. It was as if each stroke were an attempt to rebuild what fate had destroyed. The death of his wife and daughter had left no room for anything else, not love, not faith, not color. Only work, the only pillar that still sustained his sanity. The studio walls were covered with perfect models, glass towers, floating bridges, modern cathedrals, works that once impressed the world but no longer moved him. He was the architect of cities, but incapable of rebuilding his own soul. In the center of the room, a framed photograph showed the smiles of the two women who gave meaning to his life. He hadn't had the courage to touch it in years. Days repeated themselves in an automatic cycle. Enzo would wake up, draw, sign contracts, and return home without remembering the route he'd taken. The routine kept him numb, and the anesthesia kept him alive. But somewhere inside him, there was a part that still waited for something, a hidden spark, waiting for a breath. One morning, a phone call forced him to leave the house. The marble supplier had delayed a delivery, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. He walked to the nearest shopping mall, oblivious to the stark contrast between his impeccable suit and the ordinary gazes around him. It was there, amid the sound of footsteps and children's laughter, that fate began to move again. As he waited at the store counter, a soft, sobbing sound caught his attention. A woman in a white uniform, with deep circles under her eyes and trembling hands, was arguing with the cashier about the price of a doll. "It's her birthday today, please. Just this one," the woman said, her voice breaking. The manager shook his head indifferently. Enzo watched in silence. Something about that desperate gesture bothered him, an old memory, perhaps, of when his own daughter cried over an identical doll. Without thinking, he walked over and placed his card on the counter. "I'll pay," he said curtly, without looking at anyone. Silence hung in the air. The woman, confused, looked at him with teary eyes. "Sir, you don't have to." He merely nodded, as if lifting a weight. He picked up the bag, handed it to the child who was watching him silently, and turned away. Before leaving, he heard the little voice say, "Thank you, young man in the sad suit." That phrase echoed in his mind for hours. The sad man in the suit. No one had called him that in years. It was a strange name for a man who had everything except what mattered. That night, as he stared at the ceiling, Enzo noticed that the silence inside the house felt different, as if a seed had been planted.
And for the first time since the accident, he dreamed. In the dream, he saw a little girl running between buildings he had built, laughing loudly, with a doll in her arms. He woke with tears in his eyes, something he no longer knew how to do. If a simple gesture can change a destiny, imagine what else can happen. Subscribe to the channel now and follow this story until the end, because sometimes love appears when we least expect it. 2 days later, Enzo returned to the same mall, driven by a curiosity he couldn't understand. He found the store, but the woman and the girl were gone. He decided to sit in the cafe across the street and observe the activity, trying to make sense of that impulse. He was a man accustomed to planning everything, and he hated not understanding his own mind. Just as he was about to leave, he heard a childish giggle. He turned and saw the little girl with the doll running, her mother close behind, exhausted but smiling. The scene froze him for a moment, a vivid image of everything he had lost. Before he knew it, the girl spotted him and ran toward him, as if recognizing him from a dream. "It's the guy in the sad suit," Lara shouted, clutching the doll he'd bought. Beatriz, embarrassed, approached and apologized. "She's like that. She talks to everyone," she said, blushing. Enzo just smiled slightly, which seemed new even to his facial muscles. Beatriz invited him for coffee as a thank you. He hesitated, but accepted. In the small corner cafe, amidst children's laughter and the smell of freshly baked bread, the two chatted. She discovered that Beatriz was a nurse at a children's hospital, widowed for 4 years and working double shifts to support her daughter. The sweetness with which she spoke contrasted with the exhaustion in her eyes. Enzo barely spoke about himself. He simply listened, fascinated by this woman who seemed to find reasons to smile even while living on the edge of the abyss. When she asked his profession, he replied simply, "Builder of things that don't last as long as they should." She laughed, not fully understanding, but remembering the phrase. Lara, between sips of chocolate, asked if he had children. The question landed like a blow. Enzo froze, but responded with a slight nod. "I did," he murmured. Beatriz noticed the change in his gaze and discreetly changed the subject. When they said goodbye, Beatriz thanked him again. "It was a simple gesture, but you gave her the best birthday of her life," she said emotionally. Enzo simply replied, "Sometimes the little things are the only ones that still make sense." Back at the apartment, he noticed something curious. The city seemed less cold. The streetlights had a different glow, and the silence in the house was no longer the same. On the table, he left a napkin with the number Beatriz had written on it. He spent the night without calling, but without being able to sleep.
The next morning, before breakfast, he picked up the phone. His fingers hesitated for seconds over the numbers, until he finally dialed. When Beatriz's voice answered, soft and surprised, Enzo simply said, "I'd like to see Lara again, if it's okay." And without realizing it, at that exact moment, the man who had given up on life began to come back to life. The following days passed in silence, but the name Lara echoed in Enzo's mind like a melody he didn't want to forget. He found himself observing children on the streets, noticing mothers in a hurry, and feeling a consuming nostalgia. On an unexpected impulse, he went to the hospital where Beatriz worked, not quite sure what he was looking for. Upon arriving, he saw her from afar, in a white coat, comforting a crying child. There was something in her voice that calmed even the surrounding noise. When she noticed his presence, she smiled in surprise, but without ceremony, she welcomed him. "I thought you weren't going to call me," she joked. He responded with a half-smile, the best he could muster. Beatriz took him to Lara, who was in the pediatric ward, awaiting routine checkups. Upon seeing him, the girl opened her arms and called him Uncle Builder. Enzo knelt down, chuckling softly, and handed her a small paper model he'd made the night before, a little house with heart-shaped windows. "For me?" Lara asked, enchanted. "For you. It's a house that never collapses, even in storms," Enzo replied. Beatriz watched the scene, moved, realizing there was something rare there, a shy but sincere tenderness. He seemed to rediscover himself in that child's gaze. In the following days, visits became frequent. Enzo brought drawings, stories, and small gifts. Lara awaited him enthusiastically, while Beatriz began to see in him more than a benefactor, a broken man trying to rebuild himself. During one of their conversations, she mentioned that she believed fate put people in our path for a reason. Enzo laughed in disbelief. "Fate only knows how to destroy," he said. Beatriz replied calmly, "Then maybe it sent someone to rebuild." That sentence hit him hard. For the first time in years, Enzo wanted to believe there was something beyond the chaos. He began visiting Lara not just for her, but because somehow that small triangle of affection gave meaning to the emptiness. At home, the girl's drawings began to adorn his studio. He placed them among models, like talismans. The previously cold apartment gained color, a detail he only noticed when he saw the maid smile and comment, "It's been a while since I've seen flowers around here."
And one rainy night, as he watched the city lights reflecting off the windows, Enzo realized something extraordinary. The loneliness that had previously suffocated him now seemed bearable, all because two strangers had crossed his path and, without realizing it, were saving him. Lara ran down the hospital corridor with her doll and paper house in her hands. The sound of her laughter lit up the room, and Enzo watched from a distance, smiling. But at that very moment, Beatriz received an envelope with the test results. Her expression changed. The smile faded, replaced by a look of suppressed fear. She waited until Enzo left to speak to the doctor. The diagnosis hit her like a blow. An aggressive brain tumor. Inoperable, the doctor said, his voice breaking. Beatriz felt her legs weaken, but she kept a firm expression in front of her daughter. She only cried when she was alone, leaning over the ward counter. The next day, Enzo noticed the change. Lara seemed paler, more tired. Beatriz tried to hide her despair, but her eyes betrayed the truth. He persisted until she told him everything. "They said there's no chance," she murmured, her voice breaking. "But I won't accept it. I can't lose my little girl." Enzo sat there for long seconds. The old instinct to run from pain returned. He wanted to pull away, erase everything, avoid another loss. But as he looked at Lara playing, something inside him broke completely. "We'll find a way out," he said firmly, as if decreeing a destiny. From that day on, Enzo plunged into a frantic search. He consulted specialists, called clinics abroad, and offered fortunes in exchange for hope. The architect who once built skyscrapers now struggled to build a miracle. Beatriz followed him in silence, torn between gratitude and guilt. "You shouldn't do this," she said. But he always replied, "I need to." Each "I need" carried the weight of something he was trying to redeem. Perhaps the daughter he couldn't save. As the weeks passed, Lara's condition worsened. The pain intensified. The laughter became rare. But even in her weakest moments, she still said, "Uncle Enzo will fix everything. He's good at building things." Her innocence was the fuel that kept the man going. One night, exhausted, Enzo watched Lara sleep. The girl was breathing heavily, and Beatriz, sitting beside the bed, held her hand. He approached slowly, placed his hand on her shoulder, and said, "I don't promise miracles, but I promise to try until the end." Beatriz wept silently. When he left the hospital, Enzo looked up at the cloudy Milanese sky. For the first time in a long time, he said a prayer. A clumsy, shaky, but sincere prayer that life would give him a chance, just one, to repair what fate had destroyed. And that night, amidst the rain and the distorted city lights, he swore to himself that he wouldn't let that child die, even if he had to sell everything he'd built. The pale sun was rising over Milan when the doctor entered the examination room. Beatriz clutched Laura's hand tightly, trying to hide her trembling. Enzo, beside her, remained silent, his face impassive. The doctor spoke in technical terms: tumor, mass, inoperable, palliative, but to them it sounded like a death sentence. Beatriz could barely breathe. Lara innocently asked why her mother was crying. "It's just a little headache, right, Mommy?" Enzo looked away, his chest tightening like an old nightmare. He'd seen that kind of pain before, the kind you never have time to understand. The following days were filled with despair and denial. Beatriz sought second opinions, read medical articles, and begged God for a miracle. Enzo, for his part, sank into silence. At the office, employees commented on his absence. Partners tried unsuccessfully to contact him. The architect who never failed was now disappearing, driven by something he couldn't name. One night, Beatriz found Enzo in the hospital, sitting on the hallway floor, his eyes fixed on nothing. "I can't lose anyone else," he said in a whisper. She knelt beside him, touched his hand, and replied, "Then we won't." It was in that moment that their grief coalesced into a silent promise. Lara's condition worsened, the attacks intensified, and the medication was no longer enough. Even so, she smiled when she saw him arrive with flowers. "You look tired, Uncle Enzo," she would say. He would smile back, lying, "Just a little work." In truth, he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Beatriz began selling what little she had to pay for alternative treatments. Enzo, without saying anything, paid off the debts behind the scenes. When she found out, she cried with rage, "You don't have to do this." He calmly replied, "I'm not doing it out of obligation. I'm doing it because I have to." Her pride dissolved in the face of the truth. He was sick too, but from the inside out. Sick with guilt, with emptiness, with silence. And helping Lara was the only medicine that seemed to work. One morning, Enzo arrived at the hospital with an envelope. Inside was the name of a Swiss neurosurgeon, a world-renowned expert. He agreed to review the case, he said hopefully. Beatriz almost couldn't believe it. "But how much does something like that cost?" she asked. Enzo looked away. "Everything." That night, Beatriz watched her daughter sleep and whispered a prayer, not only for Lara, but also for the man who had transformed her pain into purpose. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. And while Milan slept, fate began to draw an invisible line between life and sacrifice. The following days became a race against time. Enzo gathered contacts, consulted investors, mortgaged properties. The man who designed skyscrapers was now dismantling his own empire, piece by piece, in silence. No one understood. The newspapers began to ask, why has Italy's most influential architect disappeared? Meanwhile, Beatriz was facing a different battle. Between shifts and sleepless nights, she tried to keep Lara's spirits up. The girl, despite the pain, dreamed of a trip to Switzerland. "It snows there, right, Mommy? Uncle Enzo is going to build me a castle there." Childlike hope was the only strength she had left. Enzo spent more and more time with them. Gradually, his presence ceased to be that of a visitor and became that of a family member. He helped with medicines, read stories, and sometimes fell asleep beside Lara's bed. Beatriz saw this and realized he wasn't just a rich man with guilt. He was someone trying to save himself along with them. But the disease progressed rapidly. One day, Lara fainted in his arms. The hospital descended into chaos. Enzo ran through the corridors with the girl in his arms, his heart racing. Beatriz followed him, crying, screaming her daughter's name. It was there, in that cold white corridor, that he swore, "I will save her, even if I have to die trying." After the scare, doctors said he had little time left. Enzo signed papers and sold his main company, the same one he'd built with 20 years of effort. His partners called him crazy. He replied, "I'm just trying to remember what it means to be human." Beatriz, upon finding out, begged him to stop. "You'll end up with nothing," she said. He smiled serenely. "I've had nothing since I lost them." She understood. There was no stopping the inevitable. Enzo was willing to trade the world for a life. While they waited for their travel visa, Enzo began drawing something new, a small glass house surrounded by trees. "It's for you when all this is over," he said to Lara. The girl looked at the drawing and replied, "So you're going to live with us?" He didn't answer. He just smiled. The day of the trip approached, and with it, fear. Beatriz prayed, Enzo planned, and Lara dreamed. Each fought in their own way, united by something that already surpassed reason. The night before his departure, Enzo lay awake watching Milan through the window. The city shimmered below like a map of memories. He knew that at dawn he would leave behind the man he was, and perhaps never return. And when the sun rose, he was ready. Not as an architect, nor as a millionaire, but as a man who had rediscovered what it means to love. The headlines read, "Enzo Morelli leaves multi-million-dollar empire without explanation." The media speculated, investors demanded answers, and former partners turned against him. Enzo didn't read the newspapers. He didn't answer calls. His focus was only one thing: getting the funds for Lara's surgery, no matter the cost. Beatriz, in silence, watched the man who had lost everything, but seemed more alive than ever.
Enzo's apartment was empty. Paintings were sold, furniture disappeared, and the models, once a symbol of glory, lay dismantled. Beatriz tried to stop him, crying, "You can't destroy yourself like that." He replied calmly, "I was already destroyed before I met you." That sentence marked something inside her, the recognition of a shared pain. The night before the trip, Lara asked to sleep with both of them. Lying between them, with the doll in her arms, she whispered, "Promise Mommy won't cry if I go to heaven?" Beatriz collapsed, but Enzo held the girl's hand. "I promise you'll come home and even help me paint the walls of the glass house." Lara smiled sleepily, believing, and for a moment the impossible seemed possible. The three of them set off for Switzerland in silence. On the plane, Beatriz watched the man next to her, exhausted but with a firm gaze. Lara was sleeping on his shoulder, and for the first time, Enzo didn't push away someone's touch. Inside that flight, 3 broken lives traveled towards one last chance. Hope was fragile, but it was all that remained. In Zurich, they were welcomed by an experienced medical team. The doctor in charge, a stern-looking man, warned, "The chances are slim. The child may not survive the anesthesia." Beatriz was trembling. Enzo took a deep breath and replied, "If there's a chance, no matter how small, that's what we'll bet on." The doctor looked at him in amazement, perhaps recognizing there a kind of faith that science rarely sees. The surgery date was scheduled for 48 hours later. During the early morning, Enzo went out for a walk. The city was silent, covered in snow. He looked up at the sky and thought of his lost daughter. "If there is something beyond all this," he murmured, "let my pain serve to save this child." When he returned to the hospital, Beatriz was waiting for him at the reception, and without saying anything, she just hugged him. For the first time, Enzo allowed himself to return the hug. It was a simple gesture, but full of redemption. He understood that even surrounded by ruins, he could still rebuild something, not with bricks, but with love. And that night, beside the two of them, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. But the next day would bring the price of that promise.
The Zurich hospital looked like a glass temple. Lara was taken to the operating room at 7 in the morning, smiling with the doll in her lap. "She'll be waiting for me, right, Mom?" he asked. Beatriz nodded, her voice breaking. Enzo at her side held her little hand and replied, "Always." When the doors closed, the world seemed to stop. Beatriz collapsed on the bench in the hallway. Enzo remained standing, motionless, with his fists clenched and his eyes fixed on the white wall. The silence in the hospital was deafening. He felt the same cold that consumed him on the day of the accident that took his family. The hours dragged on. Beatriz prayed silently, tears falling uncontrollably. Enzo, on the other hand, didn't say a word. In his chest, despair and hope fought a silent battle. Every now and then he glanced at his watch, as if each minute were a sentence. After 8 hours of waiting, the doctor finally came out. His tired gaze and heavy breathing seemed to carry the weight of the world. "We did everything we could," he said, avoiding looking at them. Beatriz screamed her daughter's name, overcome with terror. Enzo stepped back, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. Time has stopped. The silence was broken only by Beatriz's sobs. Enzo took a few unsteady steps to the wall and rested his forehead against the cold tile. He thought about everything he had lost, everything he had tried to fix. "Not again," he whispered, as if begging the universe. Suddenly, an alarm echoed. The heart monitor sound started beeping. The doctor ran back into the room, shouting orders in German. Beatriz and Enzo stood paralyzed, unsure whether it was hope or despair. The next few minutes seemed like an eternity. When the doctor returned, the look had changed. He took off his surgical cap and took a deep breath. "We did everything we could," he said, avoiding looking at them.
Beatriz screamed her daughter's name, overcome with terror. Enzo stepped back, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. Time has stopped. The silence was broken only by Beatriz's sobs. Enzo took a few unsteady steps to the wall and rested his forehead against the cold tile. He thought about everything he had lost, everything he had tried to fix. "Not again," he whispered, as if begging the universe. Suddenly, an alarm echoed. The heart monitor sound started beeping. The doctor ran back into the room, shouting orders in German. Beatriz and Enzo stood paralyzed, unsure whether it was hope or despair. The next few minutes seemed like an eternity. When the doctor returned, the look had changed. He took off his surgical cap and took a deep breath. "She responded," he said in disbelief. "The tumor was successfully removed. It's a miracle."
Beatriz fell to her knees, sobbing. Enzo just closed his eyes, letting the tears finally fall. Inside the room, Lara slept peacefully, connected to wires and machines, but her little chest rose and fell rhythmically, the most beautiful dance the world has ever seen. Enzo approached the glass and placed his hand on the wall, whispering, "You win, little one." And in that instant, he knew that nothing in the world was worth more than that breath. Nothing. Snow fell softly over Zurich, covering the streets like a silent veil. Inside the hospital, the room was lit by a cold white light, but Enzo's heart burned with gratitude. Lara was alive. Every tick of the heart monitor was like a pulse of hope. Beatriz, exhausted, slept in the chair beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand. Enzo watched her in silence. This woman, who had faced the impossible with faith, had taught him more about courage than all the books he had ever read. He approached, adjusted the blanket over Beatriz, and sat beside the bed. He remained there, listening only to the sound of the respirator and the soft whisper of Lara's breathing. Days later, the girl opened her eyes. "Uncle Enzo?" she called weakly. He leaned over, smiling. "Hey, little builder, do you remember me?" She nodded and smiled. "I told you I'd come back to paint the glass house." Her laughter, though fragile, sounded like music. The doctors called the case improbable, almost impossible. Beatriz, overcome with emotion, said it was God. Enzo, who never believed in miracles, preferred not to name what happened. But deep down, he knew. Something beyond logic had been at work. Maybe love, maybe faith, or maybe both. As the days passed, Lara's recovery was impressive. Every step, every smile was a victory. Enzo became known to the doctors and nurses as the man who traded a fortune for a miracle. He didn't like the title, but he accepted it silently. Sometimes he would spend hours watching Lara sleep, wondering what life still held for her. And when he looked at Beatriz, so serene, so tired, and yet so alive, he felt his chest warm. It wasn't romantic love yet. It was something purer, the feeling of belonging to a home again. But reality soon set in. The resources had run out. Debts were piling up. Enzo's empire was no more. The newspapers now called him crazy, reckless, a man who ruined his own name. He read, took a deep breath, and thought, it was worth it. Beatriz tried to talk to him about the future. "What now?" she asked. "Now we start over," he replied, smiling with the calm of someone who has finally understood what it's like to lose everything and still feel complete. She took his hand and said, "Then we start together."
Before they left the hospital, Lara asked to give Enzo something, a letter she'd written before the surgery. The writing was crooked but full of love. "Thank you for making Mommy smile. If I don't come back, take care of her for me." He cried as he read it, and Beatriz cried with him, hugging him silently. The day they left the hospital, the snow was still falling. But this time, Enzo felt the cold like a hug, the kind that awakens, not freezes. And as he looked at Lara and Beatriz walking ahead of him, he realized he was free of the weight that had plagued him for years. For the first time, he was truly alive. The flight back to Milan was silent. Lara slept with her doll in her arms, and Beatriz gazed out the window, overcome with emotion. Enzo watched the clouds below and thought about all he had lost and all he had gained. When the plane landed, he took a deep breath, feeling that a new life was beginning. In the following days, news spread. Italian girl survives impossible surgery thanks to architect who sold his fortune. The story moved the world. Journalists wanted interviews. Companies wanted to exploit him as a symbol of generosity. Enzo refused everything. "I didn't save anyone. They saved me." Beatriz invited him to stay with them until they got their act together. The simple apartment contrasted with the luxury he was accustomed to, but there was something there that had never existed in his mansions. Peace. The smell of fresh coffee, Lara's laughter, the sound of a family that wasn't his but welcomed him as if they were. The first few weeks were a fresh start. Enzo helped with chores, fixed simple things around the house, and even drove Lara to school when she started school again. Beatriz, still in disbelief, watched the once untouchable man now laughing, carrying backpacks, and washing dishes. It was like watching a painting take on color. But the shadow of the past still lingered. Bills arrived, savings ran low, and Enzo began to face demands from former creditors. One night, Beatriz found him on the balcony, gazing at the horizon. "If I had been more prudent, I would have saved something," he said. "But then perhaps I wouldn't have saved what really mattered," she replied. From that day on, the two became true partners. Beatriz returned to work as a nurse, and Enzo began teaching architecture in public schools. He no longer talked about money or fame, only purpose. "The buildings I built were cold. Now I want to build things that shelter souls." Lara, curious as ever, helped him with everything. "Uncle Enzo, can I design the garden for the glass house?" she'd ask. He'd laugh and say, "Of course, you're the best architect I know." That house, which began as a symbol of hope, now became a real project, the three of them's new home.
The neighbors, intrigued, commented. Some called him a fool, others a hero. Enzo saw himself as neither. He was simply a man who had learned that love sometimes means losing everything and still feeling whole. One late afternoon, as the sun set behind the buildings, Beatriz approached and asked, "Do you miss your old life?" Enzo smiled and replied, "Sometimes. But back then I had everything and didn't live. Here, I have little, and it's enough." And when Lara ran up to them with the doll in her hand, shouting, "Family, look at my little house ready!" Enzo looked at Beatriz and felt his heart warm. The girl was right. They were a family, built not by blood, but by love. The sun rose timidly over Milan, tinging the buildings gold. At the table in the small apartment, Lara colored with crayons, humming a song she'd learned in the hospital. Enzo watched from afar, with a discreet smile. It was strange to think that weeks before, that same girl had been struggling between life and death. Now her laughter filled the air and the emptiness within him. Beatriz was preparing coffee, and the aroma wafted through the house. "I never thought the smell of coffee could mean so much," she commented. Enzo replied, "When we live in silence for too long, any sound of life becomes a miracle." She looked at him and smiled. There was tenderness and complicity there. People kept looking for Enzo. Journalists knocked on his door, broadcasters wanted interviews, brands offered him campaigns. He turned them all down. "It's her story, not mine," he'd say, pointing at Lara. "I was just a means." That humility touched Beatriz deeply. The man who once dominated the market was now content with the bare essentials. One afternoon, the Zurich hospital sent a letter. Inside was a medical report and a photograph, Lara smiling, surrounded by the surgical team. At the bottom, a sentence in German, "Sometimes love is the best medicine." "Sometimes love is the best medicine," Beatriz read aloud, and they were both moved. Gradually, Enzo began to be recognized for other reasons. Professors invited him to lecture on empathy and purpose. He spoke little, but each word seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Architecture is about creating spaces for the body, but love, it builds space within the soul. The audience always stood at the end. Lara recovered completely. The tests showed that the tumor had disappeared. "You're a warrior," Enzo would say. She would laugh, "I'm Uncle Enzo's warrior." The girl began drawing again, and her creations always featured three figures holding hands. When asked who they were, she would reply, "My family." Beatriz watched the connection between them and felt her heart warm. She knew that what united them was stronger than any blood bond. At night, she would sometimes see Enzo sitting at the table drawing and think, he is redesigning his own life. And in a way, it was. But not everything was smooth sailing.
Bills were piling up and money was running out. Beatriz tried to share expenses, but Enzo insisted on helping, even though he didn't have much. "I've lived half my life building towers. Now I want to learn to live by building homes." She didn't answer. She just smiled, tears in her eyes. One day, Lara found an old newspaper tucked away in the closet. The headline read, "Morelli, the man who lost everything." She showed it to Enzo and asked, "Did you really lose everything, Uncle?" He looked at her, then at Beatriz, and calmly replied, "No, little one, I found everything." And in that moment, Beatriz realized that the true miracle wasn't just that Lara survived. It was that Enzo could feel again. Over time, life found its rhythm. Enzo taught at a public school, teaching young people about design and sensitivity. "Don't just draw buildings," he told his students. "Draw stories within them." The children adored him, and many saw in him more than a teacher. They saw an example of generosity and redemption. Beatriz, for her part, had returned to the hospital as a volunteer. She helped other mothers facing serious illnesses with their children. "I know what it's like to be afraid and still need to smile," she said, welcoming them. The work healed her little by little. Each hug was a reminder that love multiplies when shared. Lara grew up healthy and curious. Sometimes she accompanied Uncle Enzo to class and asked questions that made the students laugh. "Why does the roof have to have a peak, Uncle?" Or, "Can we build the house that hugs us when it rains?" He laughed, promising to try. The girls' ideas inspired him. Each question was a seed of tenderness. Despite their harmony, the weight of debt still loomed large. Enzo's old office had been auctioned off, and the Morelli name, once synonymous with success, was now associated with bankruptcy. He didn't care, but Beatriz knew it was silently hurting him. Sometimes she saw him looking at old models with a distant look in his eyes. One cold night, she found him on the porch. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He was slow to answer. "Not the money, but the people who believed in me, until I stopped being useful." She walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. "You're more useful now than you've ever been." He smiled. "Maybe I just changed what I build." Shortly thereafter, Enzo was invited to work on a community project, affordable housing for low-income families. He accepted without hesitation. "This time, I won't charge anything," he said. The local government, surprised, approved. And thus was born Home Project, inspired by Lara's story. The name was no coincidence. During the inauguration, Enzo delivered a speech. "Sometimes life destroys everything we have, not to punish us, but to teach us how to build again, the right way." The audience gave a standing ovation, and Beatriz wept quietly in the audience, proud of the man he had become.
The days passed with simplicity and affection. At night, they ate dinner together, laughed at Lara's stories, and planned the future. Enzo didn't know how, but that makeshift home had become the most solid thing he'd ever built. And the most beautiful thing, he didn't need a solid foundation, just love. One night, Lara asked, "Uncle, what is the price of a life?" He was silent for a few seconds and then replied, "Whatever you're willing to lose for love." She smiled. "So you paid dearly for me, huh?" He laughed and replied, "It was worth every penny." And so, with laughter, they celebrated what many would call a loss, but which for them was salvation. The years passed like a gentle breeze, and time, once Enzo's enemy, now seemed like a silent ally. Lara grew healthy, full of energy and dreams, and Beatriz blossomed beside her,
more confident and calm. The simple apartment came alive with colors, laughter, and drawings scattered across the walls. It was the home none of them planned, but all of them needed. Enzo continued with his social work. Home Project had expanded, bringing decent housing to dozens of families. He never returned to the luxury of large corporations, and that didn't bother him. "The walls we build with love last longer than any concrete building," he told the volunteers. Beatriz accompanied him on many of his visits. She saw how he had transformed. The man who had previously avoided human contact now hugged strangers, talked to children, and listened to stories with teary eyes. His every gesture was a way of thanking life. She knew he had healed. Lara, for her part, had become a miniature artist. She drew houses, gardens, and always 3 figures holding hands. "That's us, isn't it, Mom?" she'd say, and Beatriz would nod with a tender smile. Enzo kept each of these drawings in a folder, as if they were treasures. One afternoon, Enzo took the 2 of them to the land he had bought with what little he had left. It was a green field, surrounded by trees, far from the noise of the city. "This will be our glass house," he announced. Beatriz looked at him in surprise. "Do you still want to build it?" He replied, "Now more than ever. Not to show off, but to live in." The 3 began planning together. Lara suggested a swing in the garden and large windows to see the sun shine in. Beatriz designed the kitchen and bedroom, while Enzo detailed the foundation. This house wouldn't just be a building, it would be the symbol of a new beginning for 3 hearts that found shelter in each other. As the work progressed, Enzo felt the joy of creating again. But this time, the sound of hammer and wood wasn't stress, it was harmony. Each beat felt like a beat of the new rhythm his life had acquired. And every time he looked at Beatriz and Lara watching, he felt complete.
At the housewarming, there were no frills, just the 3 of them, a simple cake, and soft music in the background. Lara ran through the rooms, shouting, "Now we have a house that embraces us!" Beatriz laughed, moved. Enzo replied, "It was made for this, little one, to never leave anyone out." That night, they sat together on the glass balcony, watching the stars reflect off the transparent ceiling. Beatriz rested her head on his shoulder and said, "You rebuilt everything you lost." He replied, "No, I built something I never had." And so the silence that night was one of peace, not pain. The glass house became the heart of their new life. And, ironically, the architect who once built empires now lived happily inside the simplest and truest work he had ever created. The story of Enzo, Beatriz, and Lara began to inspire people everywhere. Without them wanting to, Home Project gained international attention. Documentaries were made, lectures were broadcast, and Enzo's quote from an interview went viral. "I sold walls and found a home." From then on, the glass house became a symbol of hope. Architecture students visited the site not only to learn about the structure, but to understand the humanity behind each feature. Enzo welcomed them with humility. Every brick has a story, and stories are what truly sustain everything. Beatriz watched with pride the man he had become. Gone was the arrogant architect of old. In his place was someone simple, serene, and full of faith and goodness. Sometimes she caught herself thinking she loved him not as a woman who idealizes, but as someone who finally finds solace in the gaze of another. Lara, now 10, grew up happily. She ran through the fields around the house, planting flowers, and said she wanted to build places where people could be happy. Enzo laughed and replied, "Then you need a lot of love, little architect." She winked and said, "You teach me." One night, while they were having dinner, Beatriz commented, "Have you noticed that you're more talked about now than when you were famous?" Enzo laughed, surprised. "It's because now I speak from the heart. Before, I only drew with my hands." She looked at him and replied, "And the heart is the only tool that never loses its value." In the months that followed, the house became a refuge for all who needed peace. Grieving mothers, children undergoing treatment, the world-weary, all found comfort there. Enzo said, "The door to this house will never be locked. The love that saved us must continue to save others."
One morning, Lara woke him with a hug and said, "I dreamed about my surgery. I was in heaven, and someone told me to come back because Uncle Enzo hadn't finished building our house yet." He smiled and replied, "So you saved me, little one." She laughed and kissed his cheek. Time once again played its part. The pains of the past turned into gentle memories, and the longing stopped hurting. Beatriz and Enzo, without ever needing words, became inseparable companions. One golden afternoon, he called her out onto the balcony. "Do you know what I've learned over the years?" he asked. "That wealth isn't what we keep, it's what we share." Beatriz hugged him and replied, "Then we're millionaires." And they both smiled, without needing to say anything else. That night, the stars reflected through the glass ceiling. Lara slept, and Beatriz and Enzo sat in silence, watching the sky. He thought that perhaps this was the most perfect architecture that ever existed, that of love rebuilt on the ruins of pain. Time passed with the ease of a calm dawn. Lara, now a teenager, walked through the gardens of the glass house, tending the flowers she had planted as a child. Beatriz watched her from the window proudly, and Enzo, sitting on the porch, drew again. But this time, they weren't buildings, they were memories. The house was silent, but alive. Every corner held a fragment of the story they had built together. Lara's laughter echoed off the windows. The smell of worn bread reminded them of mornings of new beginnings, and the sound of Enzo's pencil was like a gentle soundtrack to a heart at peace. Ancient pain had transformed into mature love, and love into legacy. One afternoon, the phone rang. It was the hospital where Beatriz worked. A desperate mother had arrived with a sick child, without resources or hope. Beatriz listened to the story and remained silent for a few seconds. Then she looked at Enzo and said, with the same firmness as years ago, "They need us." He didn't hesitate. "Let's go." Arriving at the hospital, the scene was the same as so long ago. White corridors, distressed looks, weary doctors. Enzo recognized in those walls the echo of his own past, the desperate man he once was. The mother was crying, the child was weak, and the diagnosis was dire. "They said there's nothing they can do," the woman murmured. Enzo knelt before her and took her hands. "There's always something we can do," he said calmly. Beatriz smiled discreetly. She knew he was talking about faith, about humanity, about not giving up. And in that moment, what had once been a tragedy now became a mission. Lara, who had accompanied them, watched everything in silence. Her eyes shone with the same love she had learned from them. She approached the sick girl and handed her an antique doll, the same doll she had received so many years ago, at the mall, from a stranger named Enzo Morelli. "She brought me luck," she said. "Now it's your turn."
The girl's mother wept. Enzo looked at Beatriz and felt a lump in his throat. That scene was a reflection of the past, but this time the outcome would be different. The cycle of life closed before them, not with pain, but with purpose. The gesture of one girl, born of love and healing, now saved another. In the following days, Enzo helped the family with everything he could. He called doctors, mobilized friends, and even redesigned a space to house families undergoing treatment. "No one should face suffering alone," he said. Hearing this, Beatriz thought, he became the man he always wanted to be. Not the richest, but the most whole. When they returned home, the night was falling serenely. Lara went to bed early, and Enzo sat on the balcony with Beatriz, watching the stars reflected in the glass ceiling. "Do you know what's most beautiful?" he asked. "Seeing that everything that once destroyed us now unites us." Beatriz replied, "Love is the only building that never collapses." The wind blew lightly. Enzo closed his sketchbook, looked up at the sky, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know if he was speaking to God, to fate, or to the people who had brought him here. Maybe to everyone. Life had taken twists and turns, but it was finally taking him home. A home he had built with love, brick by brick, soul by soul.
He sold everything he had and ended up finding what money could never buy: a home. If this story touched your heart, sign up now and experience more stories like this, stories that remind us that true wealth lies in love.